you sort of banged when this was on. And given what we made with the videos we made today, there's a pervasive problem. It pervades much of the society, and it's psychological and emotional in nature. It has some but it it's worth talking about in light of what we've said before about where the real problems are coming from. But we don't want, part of the reason to mention it is that you don't, these that that there is as always, like a younger generation, who will pick up the, like, sort of, psychological, like, the misperceptions of what's taking place in the country, be passed along from generation to generation, if it's not sort of like dispelled and people disabused of this, like, unreal thing. But particularly when it's not just unreal, but like the opposite is the very opposite is true, and the very opposite is the problem people should be worried about. There's always been a sentiment of our population, sometimes based on something real but not particular. It's not it doesn't represent a larger threat or anything, but you can sort of find, if you have this sort of commitment to this view, you can find things at any given time. But it's mostly psychological, emotional. It doesn't really represent a real threat. But there's a major, and it's been called anti-politics, which is a fear in parts of the population about the reach and power of the federal government and its potential intrusion into the lives of the citizens. It's partly why people are like. But the thing is, there are areas where say, I don't know, federal regulation, in this case, the thing being reported as sort of like, I mean, it's always something kind of, the phobia of the federal government intruding into people's lives, or that what's causing various things that people are angry about, like the economic distress they're in, or any number of things of focusing all blame on the federal government and worried that it's becoming tyrannical, and it's reached a point where people are encouraging each other to carry pocket constitutions. The level of fear and phobia of the federal government has reached a level where law enforcement is often endangered by people, like, calling themselves sovereign citizens and things. And it always it's interesting to note what the actual situation is of our federal government, and which is this: because of what we described before, the loss of economic sovereignty of our country, the fact that there's no longer a control on how much of our currency can be bought up by European banks, and the fact that there's no controls since 1971 on the movement of money in and out of our country. What's happened is financial institutions in Europe have formed what's often referred to as a virtual senate of lenders and investors, who are carrying out a moment-by-moment referendum on government policies. Any attempt the government makes to do anything, stimulate the economy, move towards a healthcare system, do anything to help the population or help the economy, how are we doing this? The government is actually powerless to do anything to help all the different legitimate complaints of citizens, where they could normally petition the government to stimulate the economy, do different things, build the infrastructure. The government has become powerless because anything it might do, which the network of international lenders and investors, and particularly this network of European banks called the Inter-Alpha Banking Network, since the 1970s, can punish the government with flight of capital, selling off our currency. So the government is actually powerless to do much of anything, including any attempt to stimulate the economy, any attempt to actually create jobs. They always talk about job creation. The government could theoretically do things to create jobs. One of which is, we've talked about this sort of the dynamic aspect of the state sector, that new waves of production can come through the Pentagon system or NASA. They should certainly be able to build the infrastructure of our country, putting people back to work and these things. All of these type of things, any move towards it will be punished from overseas banks by flight of capital. They'll start selling off our currency as a signal of what's going to happen, and should we move ahead with such growth or policies that would help the population in any way. Those are deemed irrational by this network of banks and overseas banks. It's deemed irrational. It means it helps the American people and the population. The government technically is not to be feared, but is the one place where, if we had representatives that weren't just narcissistic, distorted personalities, they can do things for the people who live in their district. They're not interested in that. But anything the government once upon a time could do to help the economy and the situation of individuals, they're powerless now. That will be punished by flight of capital. There are areas where people, you'd want, minor things that the federal government might do, that someone who's sort of hostile to regulations and bureaucrats and things like that, that phobia of that pervades society in a way that's so irrational. But now, since 1971, it's particularly irrational because the government is actually very much powerless to do anything. It's in some sense taking orders from the virtual Senate of European lenders and investors. That's what's happening. Why people are phobic of the federal government is that idea began to be driven into people's heads when the economy went under structural adjustment, and it benefited certain sectors of industry who wanted the government to stop regulating their business, like some of these senators or congressmen who were in, one, for example, someone's in, there was a guy with a very large sort of pest control business. He didn't want the EPA regulating what chemicals he could use, and he'd already made a lot of money in his business, so he ran for Congress simply for the point of getting regulations taken away on what chemicals could be used to, get rid of rodents and stuff. Those are the kind of things that certain mid-sized businesses wanted done, and because there's so many of those mid-sized businesses that has some gripe with the federal government, our media system started acting on their behalf by propagandizing the population that any problem you're having, the government is the enemy. The government is too big, it's too powerful, it's coming to regulate us all and take over our lives. We're moments away from statism coming. All of that is so unreal because the government is actually powerless to do much positive for the lives of the citizens, and doesn't have that much interest, of course, in harming the citizens. Why would it? What it really would want to do is be a place they used to be able to do things to build our economy and create jobs. That is no longer the case. They're taking orders from the international lenders and investors. That's something we could say about that.